Germans were chasing us from one end and the Russians wouldn't let us in at the other end.
Harry Schneider is remembering the summer of 1941 when his family left their home in Lomży, Poland, and fled to the Soviet Union to escape the Nazis. Harry was just 4 years old at the time. Between 1939 and 1941, nearly 300,000 Polish Jews, almost 10% of the Polish Jewish population, crossed into the Soviet zone to escape the German onslaught.
Part of the family didn't want to move. It's my grandmother, as an example. She was just too old to travel. And one of the other brothers also had married and had children, so they wanted to stay. My father came back from the army, and he says, we better get out of here, because he heard some of the atrocities that already happened in other towns. And so we started to go east.
The Soviet Union and Germany signed a non-aggression pact in August 1939. In a secret deal, the two countries carved up Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of interest. Harry's hometown was located in eastern Poland, near the Soviet border, and was in Soviet hands from September 1939 until June 1941, when the Germans came in. That's when his family fled.
We spent some times, like in the forest and the swamps in that area. And we finally reached Brest or Brest-Litovsk in Russia. One of my mother's brothers happened to be married to someone that lived there. So we finally wound up in Russia. But what happened is once the agreement between the Germans and the Russians broke up, the Germans started to invade, going further east.
So the Schneider family, too, moved further and further east. Once in Russia, Harry's dad was drafted into the Russian army.
The Russian government, they just put myself, my mother, this cousin, and by that time I already had a sister who was born actually in Russia in 1941. They put us on the train and they sent us to Ural, which is near Siberia. When the Germans were bombing the train and the rails, I can remember jumping off and on the trains, once we heard the airplanes coming along. So I do remember going down, hiding, and getting back on the train.
The long journey ended near Siberia, one of the coldest inhabited places in the world.
So we lived there with they just placed us with a woman whose husband was on the Western Front, fighting the Germans. And it was bitter cold there, but somehow we were able to survive there.
Siberia is an extensive land area of Russia, covering almost all of northern Asia. It is where the Soviets established some of their biggest prison camps and sentenced millions of people to forced labor from 1930 to 1960. And it is where the Soviet Union deported tens of thousands of Jews who escaped the Nazis into the Soviet zone. Jews were sent there and to other remote areas in the interior of the Soviet Union. And though conditions were harsh, most managed to survive the Holocaust. They were the largest group of European Jews to survive the Nazis.
When we got to Russia, it was bitter cold, and I actually started going to school, kindergarten, although it was probably maybe only 4 hours in the morning, and my mother was able to get a job actually at the railroad station, so I also had to take care of my little sister. And we had a difficult time also getting food. Had to go out sometimes in the farms and more or less like steal food and trying to pick out some potatoes or something that they had buried. They wanted to make sure that the frost didn't get to the potatoes. Well, I got to them first. I had blue eyes and I had blonde hair, so I wasn't able to sneak around in the people's farms and bring back some food. And there's many times these farmers took out shotguns that were shooting at me, and I was on the run. Also, the food was rationed, and I do remember many times standing in long lines with a bucket trying to get a little bit of milk for my sister because she was so young, she had to have some milk.
Life was difficult, but Harry, his mother, sister, and cousin were safe until 1945, when the war ended. At the time, anyone who was born or came from Poland was allowed to go back. The Schneiders decided to return to see if anyone from the family survived the war.
We didn't hear anything from my father. We didn't know if he was alive or not. My mother decided that we were going to go back to Poland to see if anyone was alive or, what was happening. And so my mother, myself, and my sister went back to Poland, and we were actually placed. Everybody came into like a DP camp, a displaced persons camp. Later we found out that my father also came back with the Russian army back into Poland, and he went back to the area that we lived, hoping maybe he could find someone. And he found out that the house was destroyed.
Like thousands of lucky people, Harry's father finally found the remnants of his family in the DP camp. But Poland was still dangerous for the Jews. In July 1946, 41 Jews were murdered and 50 wounded when Polish mobs of the city of Kielce rioted against them. Anti-Semitism still existed, and many feared that hundreds of Jews would come to reclaim their property confiscated by non-Jews during the German occupation. Anti-Jewish riots broke out in several Polish cities.
We weren't going to stay in Poland. We were trying to find a better place to go. We all went to Austria, and we wound up there in the American zone in a DP camp.
The Schneiders stayed in Austria several years before finally settling in the United States.
The immediate family survived, just my father, mother, my sister, one of the uncles, which is Mendel, and the cousin who lives in Israel. That's it. There's a book on the Lom Jews. From what we understand, in 1942, they took them all outside of town into the forest, and they were all massacred. So I would imagine that most of my mother's family, my grandmother and her brother remained there, and their children, I guess they were all massacred there.
Though Harry felt fortunate to survive, as he got older, he began to realize what his family lost.
I started to understand as to what happened to the family, and nobody really talked too much about it. But I could gather, that all of a sudden I didn't have any grandparents. I lost uncles, nieces, nephews. I guess as a kid, I was bitter. I was bitter even coming to the States. It's like I probably had like a chip on my shoulder for a long time.
Though for many years, Harry didn't consider himself a Holocaust survivor, he now travels to schools to tell young people his story.
Trying to tell them that there was a Holocaust, and to remember it can happen again. And I try to tell them that one of the worst things is hatred, prejudice. You have to stay away from that. And I tell them each one of you can do a lot of good by being a good person.